The bishop looked me straight in the eyes and told me the English world would steal my soul if I let it, and I promised him I would never go looking for trouble. I promised him I would stay faithful. I promised him I would protect my heart from outside influences, and I meant every single word I said that day. But here's the thing about curiosity. It doesn't care about your promises. It doesn't care about your intentions. It doesn't care about how hard you try to push it down. Because one question led to another question, which led to another question, and before I knew what was happening, I found myself standing in a world I had been warned about my entire life, and what I discovered there changed everything I thought I knew about myself, my community, and the line between protection and fear. My name is Sarah, and I grew up in a small Amish community in Ohio where my family had lived for 4 generations, where my grandmother was baptized, where my mother met my father, where I learned to sew and cook and pray before I learned to read, and I loved my life there. I truly did, because there was something beautiful about waking up to the sound of roosters instead of traffic, something peaceful about knowing exactly what each day would bring, something comforting about being surrounded by people who shared my faith and my values and my understanding of how the world was supposed to work. My mornings started before sunrise, helping my mother prepare breakfast for my father and my 5 younger siblings, and then I would feed the chickens and collect the eggs and help my younger sisters with their chores before we gathered for family devotions, and my father would read from the Bible in his deep, steady voice while we all sat quietly and listened. And then we would pray together. And then the day would really begin. I was 20 years old when this story happened, old enough to understand responsibility, but young enough to still wonder about things I had never experienced, and I had spent my whole life trying to be the daughter my parents wanted me to be, the community member the church expected me to be, the young woman who would one day become a good wife and mother, just like the generations of women who came before me. But there was always this small part of me that asked questions, not out loud, never out loud, but quietly in my own mind. Questions like why certain things were forbidden. Questions like what people in the English world actually believed. Questions like whether the warnings we received were based on facts or assumptions. And I would always push these questions down because I knew they were dangerous. I knew they could lead me somewhere I wasn't supposed to go. Then one Sunday after church, the bishop gathered all the young people together, and his voice was different than usual, heavier, more serious, and he told us that he had been hearing things that concerned him, stories about young Amish people who had become too curious about the outside world, stories about people who had left during Rumspringa and never came back, stories about families torn apart by choices that started with simple curiosity. He looked at each of us individually, and when his eyes met mine, I felt like he could see straight into my soul, and he said that the English world looks beautiful from the outside, but it's built on foundations that will crumble, and he said that their technology and their entertainment and their freedom are all just distractions from what really matters, and he said that he had seen too many young people get pulled away and come back broken, if they came back at all. And I believed him, I really did. Because Bishop Yoder was not a mean man, he was not trying to control us out of cruelty. He genuinely cared about our souls and our futures and our families, and I could hear the concern in his voice, the weight of experience, the memories of people he had watched walk away and never return. So I nodded when he asked if we understood, and I promised myself I would be careful, and I went home that night determined to be content with everything I already had. But the thing about warnings is that they plant seeds, and those seeds grew into questions I couldn't stop thinking about. What exactly was out there that was so dangerous, I started wondering? And why did some people find it so impossible to resist? And what did they discover that made them willing to leave behind everything and everyone they loved? These questions kept me awake at night, and I started noticing things I had overlooked before, like the way the English tourists looked at our community with such fascination, and the conversations I overheard when they thought we weren't listening, and the books I found in the back of our family's barn that must have belonged to my older cousin who left 3 years ago and never came back. I found those books on a Tuesday afternoon while I was cleaning, and I knew I should have told my mother. I knew I should have burned them, but instead I hid them under my mattress and started reading them at night by candlelight, and they were just simple novels, nothing scandalous, but they described a world I had never imagined, a world where people made choices based on dreams instead of tradition, a world where women went to college and had careers and traveled to places I had only seen on maps. And the more I read, the more curious I became. And the more curious I became, the more I started noticing opportunities I had never paid attention to before, like the farmer's market where my mother sold her quilts and where English people came every Saturday. And I started having conversations with them, small conversations at first, just about the weather or the quilts or their families, but then longer conversations about where they came from and what their lives were like. There was one woman named Margaret who came every week to buy our baked goods, and she was kind and gentle and asked me questions about my life with genuine interest, not like the tourists who just wanted to take pictures, and I found myself looking forward to seeing her, found myself telling her things I had never told anyone, found myself asking her questions that I knew I shouldn't be asking. She told me about her daughter who was my age and was studying to become a nurse, and she told me about her own life growing up in a small town where she felt trapped, and she told me that she understood what it felt like to wonder if there was more beyond the only world you had ever known. And that's when everything started to shift inside me, because Margaret wasn't evil. She wasn't trying to steal my soul. She was just a woman who had made different choices than my mother and grandmother, and she seemed happy and fulfilled and at peace with her life. I started sneaking away to meet her on days when I had errands in town, and she introduced me to other people, showed me things I had never seen before, and one day she invited me to her home, and I knew that going would be crossing a line I could never uncross, but my curiosity was stronger than my fear. Her house had electricity and a television and a computer and books everywhere, and I stood in her living room feeling like I had stepped onto another planet, and she showed me pictures on the internet of places I had only read about, mountains and oceans and cities with buildings that touched the clouds, and I felt something breaking open inside my chest. But here's what surprised me, because alongside all that wonder, I also saw things that troubled me, like the way her daughter seemed stressed and exhausted from her studies, and the medications on her counter for anxiety and depression, and the way she talked about how lonely she felt sometimes, even though she had hundreds of friends on social media. I started to realize that the English world wasn't simply good or simply bad. It was complicated. It was full of both freedom and loneliness, both opportunity and pressure, both connection and isolation, and this realization hit me harder than anything I had discovered before. I went home that night and couldn't sleep, couldn't pray, couldn't make sense of anything I was feeling, because the bishop had warned me that the outside world was dangerous, and he was right, but not in the way I expected, and my community had told me we had everything we needed, and they were right too, but also not completely. The hardest part was realizing that I couldn't talk to anyone about what I was experiencing, because my mother would be heartbroken, and my father would be furious, and the bishop would be disappointed, and I felt more alone than I had ever felt in my life, surrounded by family, but unable to share the heaviest thing on my heart. Then one night, my younger sister Ruth found the books under my mattress, and she didn't say anything. She just looked at me with these wide eyes full of confusion, and I knew I had to explain myself. But I also knew that anything I said could change our relationship forever. I sat her down and I told her everything, not to convince her of anything, but because I couldn't carry this secret alone anymore, and she listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she asked me a question I wasn't expecting. She asked me if I was going to leave. And that question forced me to confront something I had been avoiding, because in all my curiosity about the outside world, I had never actually considered walking away from my family, my community, my faith, and when Ruth asked me that question, I realized that curiosity and belonging don't have to be enemies. I went to see Bishop Yoder the next day, and I didn't tell him everything, but I told him enough. I told him that I had been struggling with questions, that I had met people from the English world, that I was confused about what I believed. He was quiet for a long time, and I expected him to be angry, but instead he told me something that surprised me. He told me that he understood, that he had been curious once too, that every person of faith eventually has to choose belief instead of just inheriting it. He said the warning he gave was not meant to stop us from thinking, but to remind us that some paths look appealing until you walk them and realize they lead somewhere you don't want to be. And he said that questioning doesn't make faith weaker, it makes it stronger, but only if the questioning leads you back to truth instead of away from it. I left that conversation with more questions than answers, but I also left with something else, a sense that maybe my curiosity wasn't a sin to be suppressed, but a tool to be used wisely. Over the next few months, I kept talking to Margaret and kept learning about the English world, but I also kept going to church and kept having devotions with my family and kept doing my chores and responsibilities. And slowly I started to see that the line between the two worlds wasn't as solid as I had been taught. What I learned is that curiosity itself was never the danger. The danger was letting curiosity lead me without bringing wisdom along for the journey. The danger was believing that different meant better, that new meant true, that outside meant superior. My community isn't perfect. I know that now. We have our own struggles and our own blind spots and our own failures. But we also have something the English world often lacks. We have connection and simplicity and faith that centers our lives on something bigger than ourselves. And the English world isn't evil, it's just different, full of people doing their best to find meaning and purpose and belonging in a complicated time, and many of them are just as curious about our lives as I was about theirs. I never left my community, but I'm not the same person I was before, because I stopped seeing the world in simple categories and started seeing it in all its messy, beautiful, complicated truth. The bishop was right to warn me, and I was right to be curious, and both things can be true at the same time. Have you ever been told not to explore something, only to become even more curious about it? Let me know in the comments because I think this is something so many of us experience regardless of where we come from. And if this story made you think about curiosity and wisdom and the courage it takes to ask questions while staying true to who you are, please share it with someone who might need to hear it today, because maybe they're standing at the edge of their own unknown wondering if it's okay to look without losing themselves. The bishop warned me to stay away from the English world, and I couldn't control my curiosity. But what I found was something more valuable than either obedience or rebellion. I found understanding, and understanding is the beginning of wisdom.